Good morning, everybody on the west side of the planet. Welcome to this session. My name is Dugan Fraser. I am the program manager of the Global Evaluation Initiative based in the Independent Evaluation Group at the World Bank. I'm very delighted to be running the second session, which is interrogating the concept of efficiency and how it gets applied in the evaluation space. This session is actually Geeta Batra's idea, and I'm very grateful for her coming up with the idea. What we did is we had a session this morning, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about what was discussed this morning. In the meantime, can I invite you to pop your name in the chat box, tell us where you're from, and we look forward to getting a better sense of who's on the call, and we'll understand maybe how we need to pitch ourselves. Our panel this morning is some very clever and eminent people. Our first speaker is Geeta Batra, who is the head of evaluation at the Global Environmental Facility. As I say, she's the person who originally suggested efficiency as a topic for Glocal Evaluation Week this year. Our second speaker is going to be Jane Davidson. She's an independent evaluator. She's known widely for her work in the Footprint Initiative, but also for her work on rubrics. Our third speaker is going to be Penny Jackson from the IEG and previously from AFDB. And our last speaker will be Craig Barham from the Cabinet Office in the Government of Jamaica. I want to take a minute to remind you about the Global Evaluation Initiative. We're a partnership. We're a network of organizations. The network includes the 6 CLEAR centers in Pakistan, in India, in Johannesburg, in Dakar, in Sao Paulo, and in Santiago de Chile. We also run the IPDET annual training program with this year a decentralized delivery in Nairobi. We host the Better Evaluation website, and we also are the convener of the annual Glocal Evaluation Week, which is a self-organized series of monitoring and evaluation knowledge exchanges. Please don't forget that you're very welcome and in fact compelled to put interesting questions and comments in the Q&A box. We're not doing translation of this session, so you don't have to worry about that. I'm going to ask each speaker to talk briefly about how they understand efficiency and what they think the term means. I'm very interested in both the legitimate and the responsible use of the term efficiency, as well as the way in which efficiency has become a cloak or a mask for other ways of combating policy intentions. So that's something we also want to talk about. This is the second of 2 sessions. This morning's session, I'm going to just give you an overview of who spoke and what they discussed. Julian King from New Zealand was fascinating on his journey from cost-benefit analysis to value for investment. And I was so reassured by what he was saying about the role of mixed methods and focusing on questions rather than being methodology-driven. Sohini Mukherjee is the director of the CLEAR Center in Delhi. She talked about the work they do with evaluation capacity development of public servants in India and was very interesting on how efficiency needs to be understood very much as a complementary principle with other important principles, including equity. Manny Jimenez from the Asian Development Bank was fascinating about how well or not multilateral development banks do efficiency analyses. He was very interesting in the difficulties that MDBs have in doing good, reliable, accurate, and rigorous efficiency analysis. And one of the things that came up in the conversation with Manny was about the need to not only talk about efficiency of the intervention, but also to talk about the efficiency of evaluations. How efficient are evaluations themselves as interventions that produce knowledge? We also had Sven Harten from DVAL, who was really interesting about the need to get better at measuring efficiency and he made a big pitch for thinking about allocation efficiency as a particular area of efficiency that needs attention. It felt like this morning's conversation was so rich that I haven't even really tried to give you a proper overview. I think we're going to have to do some sort of a blog or a paper or something on it. But I want to hand over to the speakers. Geeta Batra, you've been a real support to me in my work at the GEI, not only on content and methods, but generally, strategically. Very grateful to have you here on the call with us today. You've been I think a leader in thinking about environmental evaluation and how that gets done well, and how the evidence that's produced through evaluations of environmental interventions get used. From your perspective, how do you think you approach efficiency as a pretty cold economic concept when evaluating an environmental intervention? And has the GEF seen a change in the way efficiency questions are being asked by your partners? Over to you, Geeta.
Thanks so much, Dugan, for this. And I don't know how many of you know, but the GEF is the Global Environment Facility, and it was set up in 1992 as a result of the Rio Convention. So it's been in existence for over 30 years now, basically covering not just climate, like the other climate funds you have, but biodiversity, chemicals and waste, international waters, and more importantly and recently, the integration across all these different so-called focal areas of environment. So it covers the different environmental conventions, the UN conventions. The GEF is just going through its 9th replenishment process. And the idea, Dugan, thanks for giving me the opportunity to suggest ideas, because the one question on every donor's mind today, as we are going through the replenishment process, is how efficient is the fund, and is it delivering value for money? And so when we think of efficiency, they're questioning a variety of dimensions of efficiency. Is the fund administratively efficient? And here the GEF comes in, it's basically your overheads, your fixed, etc. And that's an important dimension. And this ranges between, 3.5 for certain funds versus 10 to 12. So that's one element. And fortunately, GEF comes in at the low end at about 3.5. So that's administrative efficiency. The second is project cycle efficiency, right? How quickly are you getting the projects approved and money out of the door? And this is another important dimension, Dugan, because people don't want their money just sitting, right? Now, I know GEI does a good job with disbursing its funds on useful evaluation capacity initiatives, and very happy to be part of your GEI family in helping anyway. But this is an important question. So how quickly are the different agencies that work with the GEF or with other climate funds able to get money out of the door? And I don't know if you've heard, but our parent institution, the World Bank, has been talking a lot about this, which is, we are reducing cycle time. We're trying to get the money out and projects approved in less than 12 months. So this has become a big deal in terms of efficiency. And then, of course, it's to economists like me and others, and you mentioned about the morning conversation about, are you delivering value for money, and in some ways bang for the buck? And this is where we actually experimented a few years ago, and we tried to assess, is there a way for us to actually assess bang for the buck in different way programs of the GEF? So we looked at 3 areas. We looked at land degradation, and reforestation efforts. And we said, if GEF is addressing the deforestation, what's the return on the GEF's investment? We also looked at it in the context of biodiversity. And the third was on sustainable forest management. And you mentioned methods. We had to use a variety of methods because we had to look at projects over time, because reforestation efforts, sustainable forest management takes a long period of time to generate gains. We combined geospatial, talking about mixed methods. We combined it with socioeconomic surveys, etc., of conducted by the World Bank and others. What did we find? And we used a sort of carbon sequestration measure to look at whether GEF investments were returning positive values. And we found an overall global positive impact, which is always nice and encouraging. Nobody wants to hear about negative returns. We found in land degradation, for example, and we did this for about 500 projects, we found that you had roughly a return on investment of about 8 cents on every dollar invested. In the case of biodiversity, which is harder to generate co-financing, etc., it was roughly 4 cents on the dollar. And in sustainable forest management, it was roughly about 10 to 12 cents on the dollar. Now, these returns were actually on the conservative side because we only focused on two kinds of ecosystem services. We also learned additional findings, right? So we didn't only, it's not only the value for money, but you also learn that these returns come over longer periods of time. You can't have donors just investing for 4 years. You need a longer time horizon. And of course, you talked a little bit about challenges, and there are challenges in measuring value for money in environmental, and that's why you've got to reinforce the systems thinking. The outcomes are often influenced through many, many external factors, right? Data limitations, to say the least, right? Remote sensing can't fully capture all local impacts like biodiversity quality or even community benefits, which also generate positive returns. So you've got to measure the socioeconomic effects in addition to the environmental. And then the whole issue of attribution versus contribution. But, this was more like, can we get even a ballpark estimate of the returns to a GEF dollar of investment? So I think despite all the challenges, I think this approach of trying to assess value for money and efficiency, I think it offers invaluable insights. And I think the more we can refine them, I think we can talk a little bit more about how effective our investments have been. So I'll stop there with that. And thanks again, and happy to take any questions towards the end. Thank you.
Geeta, I'm going to want to come back to you, particularly on the specificity of your measures, which is really impressive. And I'm also going to send you some of the material that Julian King shared with us this morning about value for investment rather than value for money. And I think you'll find that interesting. I'm going to switch over to you, Jane. And Jane, one of the reasons I invited you to participate in this event was because of your very hot take on the way efficiency is being used as a term politically. And I wonder if I can invite you to share your thoughts on that. Sorry, I'm having a bit of a cough moment. I'd also like to invite you to tell us a bit about your work with rubrics and how rubrics approach the efficiency question and how that relates to cost-benefit analysis. And finally, if you can hook the footprint initiative into your comments, I'd be grateful. Over to you, Jane.
Great, thanks, Dugan. Yeah, well, I'm Jane Davidson. I'm originally from Aotearoa, New Zealand, same as Julian King. So we've worked quite closely on rubrics methodology, and I follow his work there as well on value for investment. Being in the States, of course, I've got a front row seat right now to the great so-called efficiency drives that are happening right across government with DOGE, the Department of Government Efficiency, which is probably just an extreme version of what I think we've seen in many, many countries around the world when a particular administration comes in, declares that government is inherently wasteful and inefficient, and therefore lots and lots of things need to be slashed and burned. So in general, like the way that efficiency tends to be approached, it always seems to be about focusing on the denominator, like focusing on cutting costs with not much thought about the value that you may be cutting as you're cutting resources. So when I think about, more sensible approaches to efficiency, it's around thinking, how well are these changes in the way that we want to do things, not only streamlining and minimizing the resources that are consumed and trying to achieve the outputs and outcomes that we need, but also how valuable are the outputs and outcomes that we need and the processes that we use in order to get there. So one of the other major problems with cost cutting and efficiency drives, whether this is in the private sector, the government sector, in philanthropy, NGOs, or the big bilateral, multilateral banks, wherever you are, is that usually there's one concept that is very often ignored, and it's something called organizational slack. So my background's in organizational psychology and looking at kind of organizational frameworks and how we understand those. The idea about organizational slack is that it's deliberately inserted excess capacity that is not needed for immediate operations, but that can be used to respond to things that inevitably come up, like external threats. Think a natural disaster, a pandemic, massive political unrest, or pressure from within, like whether it's a new strategy, a whole lot of staff being off sick suddenly, or a breakdown in some kind of the system. So when an organization or a program runs extremely lean, using the least possible resources to function, it's got absolutely no ability whatsoever to respond and adapt either to curveballs or to new opportunities. So organizational slack and actually building in a little extra resource is absolutely essential for innovation and for continuous improvement. So when you have things too tight, nobody's got any bandwidth to kind of think, how could we even do this better? Because they're so busy trying to just get stuff out the door, get it done. So because this is ignored, and because the numerator, the value part of things, is quite often ignored, these efficiency drives can often go much too far. So I'm kind of, I'm looking forward to seeing, I hope there was a recording of the previous session, because I'm interested to hear particularly Julian King's take around, we've often talked about this when I was working back in New Zealand and alongside Julian and various other colleagues, that let's stop obsessing about the methodologies and like asking how do you measure things, but it's about how do we evaluate things, which is a much broader question. So it's about asking and answering broad evaluative questions that capture the entirety of what really needs to be known. So instead of like just having some efficiency measure, we ask the kinds of questions that actually matter. So it's thinking about, how well is the organization getting the best possible outputs and outcomes from the available resources in a timely way, while also ensuring that there's enough additional resource in the system to allow it to effectively respond to threats, disasters, breakdowns, new knowledge and insights, opportunities, and to be able to use innovation and evasive action. So and then another thing that sort of came up from let me just go back to rubrics for a second, because rubrics are a way of answering questions like that in a more mixed method and nuanced way, where instead of saying, here's our question, here's a bunch of indicators we're going to use, we say, here's our question, and then the rubrics describe what would the constellation of evidence look like, more or less, if we were doing really well on this, or really poorly, or just okay. I want to just throw in another kind of piece that I think that I really got from my when I was working back home in New Zealand for several years, and I spent a lot of time with Julian, and also we have a lot of great evaluators there who are Maori, so the indigenous population of New Zealand. And one of the things that I learned from them was that often there are processes that look inefficient from a Eurocentric perspective, but that actually enhance efficiency in the long term as well as value. And one of the concepts there is something called whakawhanaungatanga, which is called make like family. So when you kick off an event or a meeting or a consulting contract or a consultation, the first thing you do is you spend significant time introducing the people and saying not just here's me and here's my organization I work for, but also this is who I am, here's where my ancestors came from, this is some of my background, so that, and the idea being that if somebody knows where you come from, they know where you're coming from and what you say, and so they're more likely to understand what's going on. And also by sharing details about each other that go beyond just job title and organization and kind of what's the agenda and let's get down to business. We help make connections with people that where everybody in the audience should be able to find something about your story that makes sense to them and that helps them relate to you, that helps them connect with you better and listen with you better, and so that communication that then creates a more efficient process in the long term. But for evaluation contracting, and I was interested to hear that the earlier session was talking about the efficiency of evaluation, because this was kind of an argument here. So you would contract to do this piece of work and people would be like, what do you need all that time just to say hello to people? But it was like, it was such an investment in the relationships and the connections that would then allow things to go much more smoothly later on. So I do think that we need to check ourselves, like how many of these concepts of efficiency are very, very Eurocentric, of, you know, let's walk in the door and get down to business without finding out who's there, why we're there, all that kind of thing. So, okay, let me jump to the footprint evaluation space, because I know that Dugan threw that section in. So when we talked about efficiency there, so one of the things that we did was to take a look at the OECD DAC criteria and the criterion of efficiency. And the short term of that is just ask, how well are resources being used? So that's a super simple one. And we thought, let's reframe that a little bit, because it's not nuanced enough and people can often miss what's important there. And so we said, how about we say, how sustainably and equitably are resources and natural systems being used, protected, and restored? So yeah, so thinking about efficiency there, it's not just about how well are we using our people and our budget and our whatever, but also every single thing that we do draws on natural systems for resources. Like, you know, if we're in a, particularly if you're doing something agriculture, horticultural interventions, but every single thing we do impacts on natural systems, and how much we affect natural systems also impacts people. So there's this real coupled systems bidirectional causality going on that we need to bear in mind. But again, it's to me, it's about coming back to asking the bigger picture questions instead of obsessing about how do we measure efficiency or some particular variable. So it's about saying, how well are we not just producing the outcomes that we need to do for the human populations that we're trying to support or enhance their existence, but also how well are we doing that in a way that also protects and ideally restores the natural systems on which they and everyone else depends. So I think taking it back to those bigger picture questions and then taking a more nuanced approach to measurement rather than a bunch of indicators, because I think that gets us too narrow.
I was in a conversation a while back with somebody who referenced a book called Measurement Derangement Syndrome, which was kind of this idea that we're obsessed with measuring stuff and we don't often understand what that really means. I also neglected to mention that the session one this morning was actually started by Megan Kennedy-Chuani from OECD, who was talking about the DAC evaluation criteria. I want to invite Penny to join the conversation. Penny, it's great to see you here, my World Bank colleague. Hello. You're a recent arrival at the World Bank from the AFDB previously. Tell us about the similarities and differences in the way these two MDBs approach efficiency. And if I can be a little indiscreet, I think I've heard you being a little underwhelmed and somewhat critical about the way value for money analysis is done. Was I right? Were you critical, or was that a misunderstanding on my part? Over to you, Penny.
Okay, thanks, Dugan. I think you put me on the spot a little bit there. Let me start by just saying what Geeta and Jane just said really rings true with me as well, for a couple of reasons that I'll get to. First thing I wanted to say is just to start with a figure to give some context to the conversation. And this links a little bit to Geeta's experience with the current replenishment. OECD is estimating already this year, based on the little information we have, there'll be a 17% dip in ODA in 25. So the whole conversation about doing more with less, for those of you who were around when that conversation was happening a few years back, is going to re-enter the scene stage right this time. And to be honest, so it should, because the public have a right to know what their development dollars are doing, and that they're getting the best possible bang for their buck. So indulge me a little bit with a trip down memory lane, and I'll get back to your point, Dugan. I was once presenting what was called a value for money study on DFID, or DFID as it was called at the time, the UK Development Agency, to the UK's Public Accounts Committee. And this is more than 15 years ago, maybe 20 years ago. It went well, but there was one comment from a member of parliament that really stuck with me. He said, well, DFID, we support the work that you do, and it's difficult, so I don't really have any questions. Now, that's not the job of the Public Accounts Committee. Even my DFID colleagues nearly fell off their chairs because they know they have a responsibility to get the best possible results they can, given the limited funds they have available. And just to go back to Jane's point, I think this conversation that we're seeing, that where really efficiency is reinterpreted as slash and burn cuts, it's not even what efficiency is, right? Efficiency is about getting the best possible results for what you've got. There's the term economy, at least in the value for money framework, is more useful if you're actually talking about cuts. And unfortunately, that conversation sometimes gets hijacked. But back to basics on evaluation, the word itself has the word value slap bang in the middle of it. So evaluation is about assessing the worth of something, predominantly to decide whether to do it or not, or in the case of the ex post that many of us are involved in, whether to keep, stop, scale, adjust. Now, I think everyone is familiar with the OECD DAC criteria, including the efficiency one, basically a combination of timeliness and the cost benefit, or sometimes cost effectiveness analysis. And I think everyone is familiar with how that tends to be applied at project level. And we could have a whole discussion about the serious limitations of cost benefit analysis, especially if any of you have spoken to a very skilled modeler. They can tell you that they can give you the answer that they want, or that you want, if they just adjust a few parameters. But I come from the perspective also in my previous job of working on improving project design through a stronger learning loop from evaluations on the operations side. And I must say that we found the data on efficiency and the reasons for delays and overruns just as informative as the information on effectiveness and the reasons why project A was or was not effective. So this is important, and it goes back to the point about, the delays in project both have efficiency considerations from the point of the funders, but also, as they say, development delayed is development denied. I was thinking I could share with you data on efficiency from IEG project ratings, but in short, when I looked at the ratings across some different sectors and regions, what you can see very clearly is that there's basically a standard distribution in these ratings. And unsurprisingly, big infrastructure and difficult contexts do slightly less well. So really no surprise. So I decided not to go down that road. Instead, just one anecdotal illustration. I once did a country program evaluation. I won't name the country, though Dugan, I think you're quite familiar with it, which included a strong focus on energy. So just visualize 2 power generation projects. Project A, big. It achieved its energy generation objectives, added a significant amount to the grid, and therefore likely contribute to the higher level objectives in terms of the link to economic growth, business stability, and so on. Project B, smaller, also achieved its generation objectives, but added significantly less to the grid. The volume wasn't transformational for national energy security, but it was a useful contribution. As a policymaker, that's not enough information to inform decisions. Add to the mix that Project A was massively delayed, horrifically over budget, and dipped its toes in a sea of scandals. And again, so the development outcomes were delayed massively. Project B, small, but delivered ahead of schedule, which is very unusual, and entirely on budget. Now we have a little bit more information to help policymakers make decisions. And for the big picture evaluations, are evaluators giving policymakers the multidimensional evidence that underlie value? I think the answer to that question is sometimes, and perhaps it should be sometimes. You asked me, Dugan, the main difference between how I see efficiency being examined in the African Development Bank and the World Bank. At project level, it's pretty similar, right? Go back to the DAC criteria. But for the big programmatics, basically, in the African Development Bank, the thematic sector and country evaluations do try to cover efficiency based on the combination of generally secondary data on timeliness and costs. And there's often a lot of limitations have to be explained about costs. But the objective is to give some kind of consistency so you can look across evaluations. In IEG, and as you mentioned, I'm new, what I've observed is that evaluations are selective in which evaluation criteria are applicable. It's very much a case-by-case basis, but with a strong emphasis on effectiveness. I have seen cases where aspects of efficiency are worked into effectiveness, and one case where the team managed to aggregate a cost-benefit analysis from a series of similar projects to have an aggregate figure, which has pros and cons, but very interesting. Another looked at value for money in procurement and found what was most interesting was the variation by region. And there's other cases where efficiency is entirely on purpose, not in the scope. So my point being, it's much more a case-by-case approach, and I give you the summary of the two without prejudice or preference. But to return to my trip down memory lane when I was presenting this value for money study 15 or however many years ago, that's probably where my perspective that you might have heard on value comes from. I was professionally forged in the fire of the value for money conversations back then. It was my job to give taxpayers assurance they were getting enough bang for their buck and to help organizations to learn and improve. So I was at the National Audit Office when the original 3 E's approach of value for money came about. And the original 3 E's were economy, efficiency, and effectiveness. And it's only when you add them together that you really get the value of something. And to do that, you need mixed methods. Since then, of course, DFID added a 4th E, equity, which I think was a great addition. And linking to what Jane just said, perhaps, well, it should be actually, I forget, Julian King has also added a 5th E, which is cost effectiveness. So perhaps what is missing here in this kind of mixed methods approach to get a fuller multidimensional understanding of value is exactly what Jane was saying. There's an E missing there. Maybe we can, to simplify things, it's the environment, because what's the sustainability, the value for the people who use and rely on the land that we are exploiting in many of these cases. So that maybe is the missing piece from the value for money framework. But just to close, in my view, the value for money lens, not a cookie cutter approach. A mixed methods approach can work for some small and large evaluations. It has nuance that allows us to get away from the simplicity or the spurious accuracy of cost-benefit analysis, which often turns people off from efficiency entirely. But whether we do so or not is entirely dependent on what the evaluation questions we want.
Seem to hesitate a little.
Was making is, I think more and more our stakeholders are going to be asking us to answer those types of questions. I stop there.
Gosh, I'm really glad I invited you to be part of the panel, Penny. You've done a lot on this. I'm going to come back to these, the 3, 4, and 5 E's. But what I am struck by is how an interest in and a concern about the environment, which we historically always assumed any policymaker would have, is not something we can take for granted any longer. And I think for many people, that's a political fork in the road. And I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. But I want to turn to Craig Barham. Craig works in the Government of Jamaica's Cabinet Office, where he leads the work on results-based management. He's been doing some transformative work on creating a strong system in Jamaica, as well as supporting broader reforms in the Caribbean region generally. Craig, thank you so much for being with us. You've been, as I say, working on this RBM framework for Jamaica. And in your understanding, how well do those public management systems support an analysis of efficiency? And how does that relate to what else you see more broadly in the region amongst small island developing states? Over to you, Craig.
All right. Well, good morning, everyone. Thanks for that question, Dugan. The short answer I can start with, and then I can, build out on that a little bit, is that we've been doing this for about 15 years in earnest, and we have made progress, I'm happy to say. But to a large extent, we are still in the cultural mindset of focusing on tracking outputs and the compliance side of both monitoring and evaluation, with less attention being given to issues of efficiency and value for money. And it's interesting that this was the topic that came up for this discussion, because it has become more important recently by a strange coincidence here in Jamaica. And we have actually been switching our attention for about a year to deepen the conversation about the issues of efficiency, effectiveness, and the creation of public value by our interventions, and how monitoring and evaluation can really support that. Right now, there are two conversations that have been emerging quite a bit, and they're connected. One is a conversation within government primarily, but another one is a little wider national conversation. So what I've been getting a lot of pushback questions on within government are concerns about how much money do we spend doing monitoring and evaluation. So when I looked at the question that was sent, the first thing that popped into my mind is that there are two parts to this. There is a question of efficiency and value within evaluations themselves, doing evaluations well. How much resources do you use to do an evaluation versus the evaluation determining how much value has been created by the intervention and how efficiently the intervention was implemented or planned. So I saw it as the two things could not necessarily be separated. They're very important. So the conversation has been really about the first part, which is what sort of efficiency and value are we getting out of the evaluations themselves. So we have this rule of thumb in Jamaica. It's probably quite similar to the figures that are used elsewhere, which says that we should allocate about 10% of an intervention for program or project management, which includes monitoring and evaluation. And when we say that to politicians, to people who are outside of the program and project management sphere, they say 10%, but that's outrageous. On a major intervention that could be, 250 million to a billion US dollars, that could be, 25 to $100 million, on what we see as not necessarily delivering the actual value. If you're building a road, that means you're building $900 million worth of road, and there's $100 million that has just disappeared into the ether. So we are struggling to try and say to people, no, you cannot look at it as money that just vanishes, because the project, if it is well implemented, it is well managed. If we monitor and evaluate it properly, then of course we are going to manage it better and learn, which allows us to improve in future. If we don't do that, the intervention might not be $1 billion US, it might be $1.5 billion. So that $100 million is actually money well spent. But we're having that challenge with educating people as to the money spent on monitoring and evaluation can actually save money elsewhere. But it is not necessarily, it may seem obvious to us as practitioners, but it's not necessarily always an obvious and easy sell to everybody else. So that's one thing we're working on to change mindsets as part of the broader cultural change. The bigger conversation in Jamaica, and it's been going on for a number of years, but it's intensifying, has to do with the whole issue of productivity. And it has been widely accepted that one of Jamaica's challenges, we have invested lots of money in the last 20, 30 years, but people say we're not necessarily seeing these huge investments translating into growth. Where is the real true creation of more public value for the investment? And I think that is partially connected to this whole issue of efficiency and value creation within evaluations, because when we design our interventions, are we thinking of designing them for efficiency, for effectiveness, and what sort of a level of public value do we expect to get out of these interventions? And I'm not always convinced that when we build a road or a water supply system or a sewage system, we are looking at it beyond simply delivering the output. So I started out by saying we're kind of focused on outputs and compliance. But then, does that output really deliver greater value? And the only way you can do that is through, fundamentally, I think, or the main way, is by having a rigorous culture and systems of evaluation. And remember that evaluation is not only the impact, but you have the formative evaluations at the start, that you can try to determine what do you expect this intervention to deliver, and then you can compare that against the impact. What did you actually deliver at the end? And I think we are sort of still very much culturally focused on, it's very important to spend the money, create employment, build that 10 kilometers of road, and let's hope the road is well built. But then there are wider questions that I don't think are being fully explored. And that is where I think this whole discussion about efficiency, and I would add effectiveness and value creation, comes in. In relation to the wider Caribbean, I'm a little bit cautious of speaking for my family across the waters, but I think I will say this in my conversations with them. Everybody I speak to, there's a growing recognition of the need for stronger M&E systems, for greater use of the evidence that it brings forward by decision makers, policy makers. So I think we're all on the same page with that. But as small countries, Jamaica has the advantage, we're 3 million people. So, we're as large as the rest of the English-speaking Caribbean combined, both in terms of, size of economy and population. So we have a little bit of a luxury. We have, I think as Jane talked about slack, we have a little bit of fat around the middle that some of these other islands, even though some of them may be, per capita wise, a little bit wealthier than Jamaica, you're talking about countries with 100,000 people. and governments that maybe just a couple of thousand staff. And, as I look at them, I say to myself, you're trying to do a lot with very few people. And the reality is, monitoring and evaluation takes human and financial resources, and it takes skilled human resources. And one of the challenges the Caribbean has, of many, is because of the brain drain that we have, especially in government, when government often pulls on the brightest of society. And then we train them up. We often export a large portion of them elsewhere. So it's very hard for us to, our desires are not necessarily matched by what our capacities allow us to do. So it's a long, slow road. In terms of looking forward, I'll conclude by saying that we are making progress. And every day I say to my staff, who sometimes get frustrated and say, boy, this is a long journey. And I say to them, yes. But Dugan alluded to the fact that I'm old, and I embrace that. But one thing I've learned is that things take time, and you have to be patient. When you're young, you're impatient. When I was young, I was impatient, and I wanted to see the world change overnight. But I realize it takes time, it takes continuous effort, it takes thoughtfulness. A lot of things have to go into building whatever systems, whatever institutions you want. And I want monitoring and evaluation to be institutionalized. And that's a term I keep saying, that my job is to institutionalize it. And that's not an overnight process. And there are three challenge levels that we have in institutionalizing M&E, and more specifically, the cultural shift towards efficiency, effectiveness, and value creation. And those three levels, I simplify it by saying it's the political level, the senior leadership level, and the level of the practitioners. Now, I think, I'm proud to say, I think we have largely won the battle with the practitioners, the lowest level. The people that I interact with day to day, we have a community of practice. We meet 4 times a year. We have a corporate planners network. We meet another 4 times for the year. And of late, we've been getting requests can we go from half a day to an entire day, because the interactions, the learning that takes place is so valuable. When I heard that, it's rare to hear people ask for more training, but I was pleased, because it means that the people who are the ones who are doing the work in the trenches are starting to buy into what we're doing.
Craig, I'm going to have to ask you to wrap.
Sure. But the challenges remain at the political level. They're important for setting the tone, but they don't really often understand exactly what is involved in what we're doing. That's not their area of specialization. The middle level is the senior leadership of government, and they're more aware of what we're doing, but we find that they're very much still reluctant consumers of what we're trying to achieve. And they're in a very difficult position at their level, because, of course, in many cases, from the pressures from below and the pressures from above stop with them. And of course, I can very much appreciate the difficult position sometimes that level of management is in. But those are the two levels that we still have to do a lot of work. And when we do that, I think, we will start to see that cultural shift to fully embracing and understanding of efficiency and evaluation, both within evaluations and in terms of what the interventions deliver.
Thank you, Craig. I mean, so much of what you said is really fascinating. One of the things that they do in the African context is they have the African Parliamentarians Network on Development Evaluation, APNODE, which targets parliamentarians. And the problem with that is that parliamentarians change all the time, right? So you work with someone, they get their head around it, and then they get voted out of office and someone else takes their place. So I've come to understand capacity development as an ongoing, sustained task that has to be implemented as part of our regular maintenance of our systems. But the other thing you said was you talked about designing interventions so that an efficiency analysis is possible later, and using evaluability assessments as ways of doing that. We don't have many comments in the chat box. There is one question from Chandan Samal. How do we measure the value for money in policy interventions in sustainable landscape programs which take time? Any particular methods or approaches to address the results? So if anybody would like to address that question, you're very welcome to. But I'm actually going to just now move to each of the speakers, and I'm going to go back in the same order. Geeta, what have you heard today that you really resonated with? Is there anything in what was said today that you disagree with? So your closing thoughts. Over to you, Geeta.
Thanks, Dugan. I think this has been a really good session to understand. I think to reinforce my thinking, and I've learned a lot from from the colleagues on this panel. I think we have stretched our donors, and some governments have taken the idea of efficiency a bit too far without understanding what you're giving up when you in the quest for higher efficiency. And so I think taking that with against effectiveness, so measuring efficiency and effectiveness together is really important. And recognizing the trade-offs between efficiency and effectiveness is really critical. And I'm hoping that when you listen to OECD DAC and Meg this morning, I don't know if she highlighted that, but to me, it's a constant dilemma of you want to push for efficiency, but what you're giving up in terms of effectiveness. So I think keeping that in mind. The second is, of course, the challenge in measurement. But unfortunately, I think the people who are financing us do want some numbers. And yes, there's a danger. I hear Penelope and I hear the others talking about, let's not get fixated on numbers. So I think erring on the side of caution, maybe giving ranges as opposed to a number, I think would be important. But I don't think we can get away from not providing data, frankly. I think people are asking for it. And so the more I think we can build as evaluators, get country systems like in Jamaica, Craig was talking about convincing people on the use, but then getting the measurement right at even the country level is important. Because at the end of the day, we're going to rely on the metrics. The evaluators need the numbers and the data that come out of systems, right? So I don't think, and maybe getting people who are also implementing projects, if they can get good data from the ground to make sure that we are not overselling efficiency or putting them in a tight spot. I'll stop there. Thank you.
But Geeta, before I let you go, I know you're in this process with your replenishment right now, so this is coming at you hot and loud, right? Is efficiency taking on a kind of more intense kind of dynamic at the moment? And does that relate to the political shift in the US?
It is related to the political shift here because, if, what they say, what is it? If one person sneezes, what happens to the others, right? It's like, it's that effect. But I think it's also, it is time. It is a wake-up call. I think some of our bureaucracies have expanded a bit too much. And we haven't paid attention to the development impact in relation to the dollars spent. So to me, efficiency is all about, it's not just about the actual money just going out of the door or how quickly are you spending the resources, but what's the impact you're getting in relation to the resources being spent. And if in one country, the return is much lower, we can analyze and provide that perspective. That's what evaluators need to do. You cannot expect the same return in an FCV context or a difficult environment that you can in a normal place, right? Or in a more developed country. And coming to this policy-related question on sustainable forest management, it does take time. It takes time to generate returns, especially in environmental projects or in any huge infrastructure project. It takes time to get the development outcomes you're looking for. But I think during that period, there's an onus on evaluators to talk a little bit also about process efficiency. If you're doing a public-private partnership, there are a lot of indicators or metrics or measures or reporting you can do during the period, right? How is the dialogue process proceeding? We know that 50% of public-private partnerships don't even succeed. But what have you learned in due course through the process? There are efficiency gains to be made even from process learning. And I think evaluations can focus on that dimension and not exclusively on the metrics at the end. Thank you.
So interesting, Geeta. And I mean, so much of what we do is in fact rooted in a political orientation, right? And when that shifts, we kind of left a bit unmoored. Jane, what's your final thoughts and your closing remarks, madam?
So interesting to listen to all the different perspectives on this. And, I really think this is a conversation that should be carried on. I think efficiency so much often focuses on, I don't know, the primary intended purposes of something and doesn't think that hard about differential impacts or side impacts. So I think, for example, when equity is ignored, when you try and maximize efficiency by focusing on your easiest to reach populations, right? When you get pushed for efficiency, the best way to do everything cheaply is to just go for your easiest to reach populations, the one you can get quick results with, and then you end up ignoring your hard to reach populations, your most marginalized people, and you end up exacerbating the inequality that plagues our world. So same thing happens with the environment. When you focus on human systems efficiency at the expense of our natural systems, this is part of an extractive colonizer mentality. That's how we ended up in this climate and environmental crisis and massive inequality, because certain groups of people are seen as just resources to be extracted, and same with the environment. And so in the drive for efficiency, we're just trying to, feed the loudest voices or whoever. So I think in evaluation, one thing we don't do well enough is asking how well a policy or initiative balances the various needs and concerns that it is or it should be responsible for, not just those with power and a voice, but also future generations and the natural systems on which our future generations depend. So I think this multi-constituency thinking has got to be put more to the forefront and not sidelined by these pushes for efficiency. So evaluators are some of the people who can help push back against that kind of thing by calling it out. So let's do that.
Oh, it sounds like you expect us to be brave and courageous. Gracious me. Penny, you have a minute. Over to you, ma'am.
Yeah, thank you, Dugan, and thanks for this really interesting discussion. I find it very difficult to disagree with anything that's been said. And what Jane was just saying, I think, is really hitting the nail on the head, because not to harp on about it, but the value for money concept is, if you don't get the effectiveness, then the fact you had high efficiency or economy is irrelevant. You didn't get value for money. You didn't achieve results. So if you're driving efficiency too much, that you're undermining your effectiveness, that's not value for money. And if you add to that the question of value for money for who, then you get to the equity, right? You get to who is this all about? Are we just reaching the people that are easiest to reach because we know hard to reach rural and difficult countries? It's more expensive. It's a fact, but it's a strategic decision to make. And then again, if you add the environmental side of things, you have a multi-dimensional framework. And absolutely not to say that numbers and metrics are not useful. They are absolutely useful. It's just a question of applying mixed methods so that we can have even more. It's and, not or. Thanks.
Fantastic, Penny. And our last speaker is going to be Craig. Over to you, Craig.
All right, thank you, Dugan. You mentioned somebody raised a question about policies, and it triggered something in my mind, as it may not be quite the question the person was answering, but it has to do with the fact that I don't think we spend enough time here, at least here in Jamaica, considering evaluation of policies. We tend to be very highly focused on evaluation of hard interventions. So a water supply system or a road that's built. is it delivering sufficient water to the community? Has it cut travel time? But then, as I listened to the question, I said to myself, but hold on, you have a transport policy, and that transport policy is going to determine the mix of that transportation between road, rail, subways, whatever. And when you evaluate the discrete intervention, the 10 kilometers of road built between two towns, what does that say about the wider policy that caused people to choose to build that 10 kilometers? And where is the efficiency, the effectiveness, and the value creation in the policy side versus the hard intervention side? And I think one of the weaknesses we have here in Jamaica, I'm not sure if it's reflected elsewhere in the world, is I don't think we have the balance between understanding efficiency, effectiveness, and value creation of policies versus the hard capital investments.
Thank you, Craig. It's lovely to hear from somebody who's grappling with this in the belly of the government beast, and you offer such a rich perspective. I want to thank everybody who's been on the panel. I want to thank everybody who sat in the conversation. My measure is always how many people stay on the call, and of our 60 participants, we kept 53 people online throughout the session, which I think is good performance. I do think this is a conversation we need to sustain. I want to thank my team, Megan, Claudia, and Patricia, for your work on Glocal and on this session. Thank you very much, everybody. Thank you so much, Geeta, Jane, Penny, and Craig. I hope you have a lovely day, and I look forward to finding ways to keep this conversation going. Thanks so much, everybody. Bye-bye.
Thanks, Dugan.
Thanks,
a lot.
Dugan.
And thanks
Bye-bye.
to the team. Yeah, thank you.